All right, well, it's been a minute. This is actually my second time trying to do this introductory section because I recorded one. Initially, this shows you how out of practice I am, and somehow it disappeared into the netherworld. So apologies if what I'm saying in the beginning is a repeat of some of the other stuff. I don't have time to go back and listen to the whole thing again and figure out which pieces I forgot to put in the beginning. But this is Allison, Marigold Cottage, Hot Springs, Arkansas. It is now September, and we've moved from the mid to upper 90s down into the high 80s, which is a glorious relief. And I've been spending it was a slog through late July into August, keeping my garden alive. A lot of quality time with the hose and learning from the garden, like cycles, what's happy, what's not happy, what can make a comeback if you have like a nice soaking rain over 2 days, and things like the calendula that you thought were goners like pop up again. So that's inspiring, and sort of co-creating with all the garden devas and the energetic systems of the seeds and all those 100 jugs that I had out all over the winter, and now they've turned into perennials and coneflowers and common yarrow, and I'm gonna have like enough stalks to have like the 50 stalks you need for throwing the I Ching with the yarrow stalks, which is super cool. And I've been digging lots and lots of new beds because I'm getting like 20 little tiny shrubs. They're like 3-inch pots, but all kinds, viburnums and beautyberry and fothergilla and like forsythias, little shrubs. I spent extra so that they wouldn't get ginormous because I only have a 0.21 acres of land here. But so many hummingbirds, so many butterflies. In the evening, I have these Peruvian marvels of Peru, or 4 o'clocks, that open at dusk along with the Nicotiana, and lots of sphinx moths come to those, and they're really kind of freaky and also interesting. And this morning I was sitting here in my chair looking out my picture window, and like my little tortoise friend like is walking along and by the herb bed, and there's a little toad yesterday. So I haven't seen that many snakes. I wouldn't mind. Last year I saw a couple of king snakes, which were good. But yeah, total learning experience and still in process. You know, I kept thinking by the fall I would maybe do a walk around tour of the garden, but it's still a work in progress, so it might have to wait till next spring. I have a bunch more bulbs coming too, so that'll be really great. And yeah, so it's been a minute since I've been here, and I thought this was gonna be short, but it is over an hour at this point. But I have places I have to be, so I'm gonna just sort of cut to the chase. This next hour of content is sort of a blending mashup of things that I've been thinking about lately, and again, inhabiting the participatory universe frame, the curious observer, the live action animist role play musical, that we can have agency in this playful universe if we can control our lens and what we let in our energy field and what we keep out, and how we can reimagine the plot line, because there are infinite ways of being creative with the plot line. And so this is looking at oh, and the other fun news that I have that I mentioned in this content is that this fall I'm hosting a salon the 4th Saturday of the month at the Star Portal in Mountain Pine, Arkansas. It's a free event, but contributions towards offsetting costs at the portal are gratefully appreciated. And the salon is the Glazy Po Flow is what I'm calling it. And Glazy Po is the creek that runs through the land that the portal sits on. It's about 2 or 3 acres. It's a little wooden church, and then there's a section of a woodlot, and then there's a creek. And Glazy Po stands for Paul's Salt Lick. And that's super interesting because we're interested in networks and flow states. And so an hour of it is going to be me showing quirky clips of things I make quirky clips of and talk about it with people about like esoteric economics and interdimensional communication, which is something a lot of people here know way more about, like in terms of energy stuff, than I do. But I know the weird emerging tech and economy stuff. And then we're going to go play in the woods for an hour and a half and make an interactive, creative, participatory art project with jute sort of strung in the woods, like a clothesline art gallery where we make like handmade art and mandalas and things to put like good energy for what we want for the future of Hot Springs out into the ether. As a group, and it's very old energy work, and I'm excited to do it and see what unfolds, and working on the part of me that wants to control and plan everything and realize I just need to frame out a good container and then let the exciting, fun things, possibilities happen. And I think it will. We had a really nice celebration at 88 Lionsgate at the portal, where I brought a whole bunch of flowers and peppers and milky quartz. Well, the flowers and peppers from my garden, and milky quartz I got from Coleman Mine, and cleaned it all up. And then we made 2 intersecting 8-8 infinity loops, and we all like created this mandala, and it was beautiful. And then we spent the rest of the evening in the lake with the full moon, transformational moon, and like that's life in Arkansas, and it's pretty darn good. So, oh, and Glazy Po means Paul's Salt Lick, and it was a salt lick in a clay area. So there's clay, which is like, you know, salt of the earth, and clay, of which the bodies are made of, in the sort of mythic sense. And salt is also alchemically sort of the physical grounding for soul work. And so I feel like a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is sort of individual and collective soul alchemy, which is what James Hillman was looking into back in the day in the 70s in Dallas with the Dallas Humanities Council and Gail Thomas. So yes, soul alchemy, playful universe, and co-creation. And yeah, just pick a future that's better than the one that they're feeding you on the feed. So the key pieces that I'm going to touch on, what instigated this, I have a friend, Laura, who sent me a slide deck from 2018, and Paul Pangaro, who was a protege of Gordon Pask, who I think was the basis for John Hackworth in the Diamond Age. I know it's backwards. He was teaching in Detroit, a design charrette, and making a presentation about the future of autonomous vehicles to Samsung in 2018. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about payments and meditation, and Citigroup was part of it, and Subaru was part of it, and Subaru has these ties to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. So that came in, and then I had another friend send me a very long talk by this guy, Eric Dollard, who is sort of a brilliant polymath, quirky guy, and he had a whole history. He's like a Tesla expert, and was involved in trying to rehabilitate the Integratron in California, and worked on sort of secret Navy projects. And he sort of was laying out this whole history of electricity and electromagnetism, and with a lot of focus on Charles Steinmetz, who I knew in my maps from being at GE, but also besides working on alternating current, being involved in technocracy and energy payment systems. And so that was all really interesting. And so these two things of like the electrical systems made me think about Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, and that Ford and Edison were working in the early 1900s on electric cars. And I went to Edison's lab in northern New Jersey and went to the garage and saw his electric cars. And so this sort of what was going on with the Ford Edison mashup of the electric cars in the early stage? Why did it go away? Why is it coming back? And what does sort of the car as the outside-in robot mean for networked frequency, like, and swarm intelligence within the human being? And thinking about the future of accessing the field in a controlled environment as individual agents in flocks and swarms through traffic, and how that is all possibly going to unfold. And I'm just framing this as a thought experiment. I'm not saying like, oh, this is definitely happening, or there are people who know this, or whatever. At this point, I really think whatever is unfolding is a pattern that's happening in a different dimensional space. And it's like a self-assembling process that's happening all over, bits and pieces at a time, and things clicking together, and that no one person really understands the whole pattern. And so I'm just making my best guess at the things that I've seen over time and how I plug them in and telling a story. So this is just a total hypothetical story using bits and pieces of information people have shared with me, both around the history of electricity, around my experience with Ford and impact philanthropy and ed tech and community development, and then my friends, what she had shared about these like in-car payment systems and Citigroup, and knowing that Citi is connected to sort of the main funder of the complexity work at the Santa Fe Institute, and how it all mashes together. So apologies that I lost the first recording that I did this segment. I hope this is not too choppy, but I'm going to segue in I'm going to sort of go over recent clips that I've uploaded, and even though maybe to people who are looking from the outside, they would all seem disconnected, but for me, they're really relating to a future of projective geometry and like holographic reality and interdimensional space and angels and angles, and how reality is woven together here with our co-participation with the patterning. And so I'm going to talk about the video clips, and then I'm going to spend some time with the maps and showing sort of how I feel like things are linked with digital community currencies and super intelligence, hybrid intelligence optimization for flocking and swarms and quantum biology and distributed computing, and how that relates to token economies. And then Henry Ford and his great-grandson Albert, who's bankrolling the Veda cosmology temple in India with the Hare Krishnas, and then on to like looking more specifically at that presentation with Pangaro, and looking at Gordon Pask and his role facilitating as sort of a theatrical cybernetician conversation theory between humans and robots, and how this relates to a recent paper that came out about sort of Centaur intelligence and AI and logos and co-creation. And I think it's all really interesting at this point. And it also, for me, it overlaps with a book that I just ended, like all these synchronous things happen. And there seem to be lots of overlaps with a book I just downloaded called Rise and Fall of the DODO by Neil Stephenson. And he's always my go-to person for like squint and look sideways, and you can kind of peer into like the space that they're operating in. And that these token economies around possibly in-car flow state meditation could be linked to navigating historical morphospace, which is the most recent clip that I uploaded today about the field of possibility, and that it's not just biological morphospace, but it could also be the potential of space being like everything that ever happened, and how we navigate from point to point to point to point individually and collectively. And that there's many different routes through the thing, and that in itself is a labyrinth. And at the end, the last segment, I'm going to be reading about Hackworth and his experience of a dynamic labyrinth, and that it actually is deep soul work. And so I feel like for me here in Hot Springs, I'm having a great time. I'm getting ready for the Renaissance Fair. I've got my little character planned out, Avelina Locke, the hedge witch, whose boat was attacked by pirates and she washed up on the shore, and then the Fae helped her out and she learned a lot about herbalism, and then is working in this tiny village in England with Sophia Rose, the queen of the gypsies. And so I've got to make my Elizabethan kirtle. That's the thing I've got to make next for my costume, and my chemise. And so I have a lot of linen. I bought the patterns and I've got the linen washed, and I need to make much more progress this month. So I'm living a good life. I'm out on boats. I'm swimming. I'm playing with friends. I'm doing gypsy dance practice, and still thinking a lot of these big thoughts. And again, as the thought, and doing work, clearing energy stuff with my friend Heather Honey facilitates this core health training, which is sort of energy work, and just getting really grounded and being clear about being the person I'm here to be. The fractal of the divine here, and holding it down on Marigold Circle, the squared circle. So anyway, stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this segment, and I'm not sure. Like, I'm just popping in when it feels like I have stuff to share, and just consider this a thought experiment. Just entertain it. There's some interesting possibilities. Here's my YouTube channel of my latest uploads over the past month. And sort of just to walk through, I have quite a few from Stephen Hertenstein and the Ibn Arabi Society, because a lot of the aspects of projective geometry, the universe is projective geometry and math, and sort of but as a sacred process of an interrelationship between a divine force of creation and us here in 3D space-time, and the resonance happening through angels or perhaps angles in the geometric form. And that what we're doing is we're creating bridges and we're voyaging into these spaces. And I was just looking at a Michael Levin talk, a recent talk of his, really discussing morphospace and the idea of patterns. And so I think a lot of the tokens, the tokenization that is going to be coming through the UN SDGs is related to Gestalt, to creating certain forms of patterning, and that the patterns are ways of navigating morphospace. And what I just uploaded today was this guy, Thomas Moynihan, on deep possibility. This is a really short one, just 2 minutes. But he's talking about essentially like a morphospace of time and history, right? And that's, imagine like everything that's ever happened is out there as quote unquote space, right? Info space, geometric shape, and we're individually and collectively navigating our ways through this space. And that the navigation part may be connected to field access, intuitive access in meditative states, that we then come to a consensus through some sort of telepathic or psi network, and that's the emerald gate, the subtle energy that's monitored in the outside-in robot car to collectively determine an optimal next iteration of morphospace history. And that's sort of like the laminated space-time. Imagine like we're co-creating a film together, and whatever the next frame of the film is that we're in time navigating, not that we're collapsing reality, but that there's this huge space, almost like the cars are spaceships, and we're navigating through the next coordinate in space, through these tokens that create a gestalt pattern. And that gestalt patterning is a really central part of the Diamond Age as well, with these drummers, the underground drummers that Hackworth gets sent to for a good amount of time. And then I also have this discussion about markets being used, Hayek theorizing that markets are actually used for computational purposes. And so economics are not strictly economics. They're economics plus, and the plus side is distributed computation. And now that it's being put on blockchain with digital currency, like it's a whole new game. So imagine distributed computation in car/spaceships and in car/spaceship meditation with tokens to shape the gestalt of Moynihan's deep possibility. So again, I'm not saying this is definitely true. I'm just putting it forward as a thought experiment because I think it's an interesting thing to consider. And then Gracia Lopez, she was giving a presentation on sacred geometry. This is a longer clip, it's 15 minutes, but she was talking about our interactions with these other informational spaces through angels, which is part of the Persian, well, actually it's not Persian, but the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi and his ideas around the interconnection between the here that we experience as reality and like the ultimate divine source, and that they're intermediaries and that the angels are facilitating that. But I think in the lines and the threads that are going between in those interactions, that those create crosses, which is kind of interesting. Can you see my little cross in my navigation symbol up there? That they're weaving cross pieces, the warp and the weft, into a tapestry of the reality of time as a fabric. And so we're like, as we're zipping around and doing phenomenal psi-based consensus token transfers and radical participatory voting in our electric vehicles, autonomous self-driving cars, or maybe even electric bikes or those electric scooters and these electrical fields, and getting nano payments for the ideas that we have, that it's weaving the tapestry of reality into these different folds. And then the folds kind of goes over to, and I haven't been able to do Kunst. Let me see if I can find him. Yeah, he has an interesting website. It is
the aim of this series.
The Boundary Language channel, Donald Kunze. So I would highly recommend this. His videos are a bit eclectic. Some of them are very short. They're a couple of minutes, and they relate to lectures that he's given. And then some of them are longer. But you can see there's a lot having to do with the torus and how it's sliced in different ways in intersecting fields, and this aspect of geometry and architecture and folds. And so if we imagine like the Kavli Institute, they have a torus with a little rat running around inside, like a game, like a landscape, and it's just a perpetual field. Here's this, like him pinching a torus. So there's a lot with this projective geometry and how things enfold and unfold, and sort of, if you can imagine, through the gestalt patterns that we're navigating through the morphospace of a giant torus field and the coordinates collectively, that perhaps this digital commoning under the UN SDGs is actually, we're all collectively piloting reality, right? Like through token consensus, which is kind of a crazy thing to think. And I don't know that it's true, but I'm just putting it out there for consideration that this may be a way of navigating interdimensional space-time, sort of the historic and time equivalent of what Levin talks about in terms of morphospace. So here I've made a map. And what brought me to this, it was usually it's like two things that gets me to pay attention. One is that Laura sent the clip about Pangaro and the meditation cars and self-driving cars. The other is I had a friend send me a link to a presentation by, oh gosh, it's actually, I think this is what I want. A presentation by Eric Dollard. I think, is that? Yeah, Eric Dollard, and it was about sort of the history of electricity and electromagnetism. And that's what got me to thinking again about electrical fields and EMS in cars, but not just like, oh, this is something bad that we have to be worried, like, I'm not saying it's good, but like the normal thing would be EMF, it hurts your body and don't do this and don't do that. And I'm not weighing in one way or the other on that. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but what I'm saying is there's another thing, which is an energetic field, which is what I sense that the Emerald Gate folks are really interested here in the subtle energy research. So, you know what, I'm going to pause here and expand my window so I can show the whole thing. Actually, before I do that, I wanted just to stop and say, when we're talking about Henry Ford and his connection to Thomas Edison, Ford was like 15 years younger than Edison, and apparently when Edison died, they bottled his final breath and capped it and then gave it to Henry Ford, which is like, wow. And Ford's Museum of Industry is dedicated to Edison. I think it was opened on Edison's birthday. So there's this overlap. And so I think that Edison, as an inventor and entrepreneur, was one of those people who is probably, as Brooks Atwood might say here, pulling things in from the field, that's the kind of person that Edison was. And so when I uploaded this clip from 2012, which is Peter Thiel at Harvard on human capital finance, and again, I can use this lens of listening to Thiel speak about the future of education and if you're getting your money's worth on the investment that you make, being totally tied to human capital finance and social impact finance. And yes, that. But also, if you look back at Thiel, he had these connections to the philosopher Rene Girard, and essentially that influence of Girard was around human desire and social contagion and mind viruses and other things. And Thiel, part of the influence on Thiel was this idea that he gave a paper or a lecture, I think a series of lectures at Stanford called 0 to 1. And in it, he was talking about that essentially, well, I think it got rephrased by Wired Magazine or something as like, competition is for losers. And that's not exactly what he said, but essentially he's saying if you want to start a giant new company, and of course we know probably most of the giant new companies are not just the Horatio Alger stories of like, two guys in a garage, that it's part of a much larger structural network, and that part of the story is never told. But if you buy the surface level of like, two guys in a garage have an idea, that you don't want to actually compete for an existing market segment. What you want to do is invent something that is totally, that comes from outside what we currently have or know or understand. And that's where you're going to get the next big giant idea, is something that we can't even totally imagine yet. And where do you get that? Well, you get that from the field. And so for a long time when I was in the ed tech space, I kept seeing things like with the Gallup polling, which is interesting now that we think about Gallup polling and consensus reality and tokenization of voting and participatory democracy and the honeybee dance and all of these things. Because the Gallup is a polling system, right? And so the polling is towards consensus. But the Gallup people were really interested in like entrepreneurship in K-12 education and making lots of entrepreneurs. And at the time, it didn't really seem to make sense. Well, at the time, as someone who was occupying sort of a left-leaning progressive, socially progressive stance, I was thinking of this as a straight-off economic model, and that it seemed somewhat absurd to be advancing entrepreneurs when we really didn't even have an understanding of what the future of work looked like. But now what I'm realizing is another way of looking at it is that the Peter Thiels of the world and the people who know that it's possible of interacting with the field the way Edison did, is that to have a quote unquote human flourishing society, you would want lots of people pulling things in from the field as entrepreneurs. And that entrepreneurial mindset would be tokenized with these nano payments tied to your intellectual property on blockchain. And the ability to get into the field, there are various ways, right? Like there could be doing guided meditations in your car while you're in transit on the LA freeway, right? Which you think of like Los Angeles and the city of angels, or is that the city of angles in projective geometry? Like if you're going to have a perfect place to launch like car culture, spirituality of navigating Maya, the Grand Illusion, combining Crotona and Theosophy and Hollywood and I don't know, I'm sure the Scientologists and the Jet Propulsion Lab and like all like rockets, like what are rockets exactly, right? And all of the stories that we tell ourselves, like to set it and situate it on a traffic jam on the LA freeway with everyone meditating in their cars in like a transcendental flow state, guided by red light cameras and smart traffic lights and smart pavement. Like it's kind of funny to think about. So I think the reason I put like the Thiel thing in here is about the entrepreneurialism, and that's I think the Ford and Edison mashup is that piece, is that Edison was someone who was the entrepreneurial person pulling things in and then making them work in 3D space-time, and then how that all fits. And then I will also mention I have this clip here about the Aquarian age and heart currency, and that's EOS, which is this EOS is also Aurora, and that they're using this chestahedron. They were using chestahedron as their logo. Now this is very dated in blockchain world. It's 2018, but at the time, EOS launched like a $4 billion initial coin offering and was huge, and then kind of sabotaged. But it's hard to say in multi-level chess if the sabotage was just a setup for the David and Goliath comeback story. I'm not so sure, because there's a lot going on with Aurora and EOS and electromagnetism. So now I'm going to go back to the map. Okay. So the thing about the car is the outside-in robot part, right? And it's electric cars. Now, the thing is, the electric car was actually like Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were investigating electric cars in the 1910s. And I actually did a site visit to Edison Labs in Orange, New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and was in Edison's garage with some of the first electric cars. So this predates all of this. This is about 4 years ago, but it was really interesting. And you couldn't go in the house at the time because of the lockdowns, but from the outside, you could see in Edison's his house, which was very, very elaborate with a lot of stained glass, that a transom over one of the big picture windows had an Aladdin lamp. And Edison was a theosophist. And the other thing is that Ford was a big believer in reincarnation and transcendentalism. And you know, he discussed this with theosophists, with the Sufis, with other, you know, with various people. And you know, he was someone who was working on like large scale complex systems. That's what Fordism was. You can look at it from an economic lens, which I did for a long time on the left, but I think it's really the assembly line is a complex system. And I would say what's really interesting to me is that Albert Ford, his great grandson, is currently the main fundraiser behind ISKCON's Vedic cosmology temple in India, the dome of which can hold 10,000 people. So talk about spiritual technology. And Albert Ford has been involved with the Hare Krishnas since the 1970s. And he says, yeah, no, my great-grandfather would totally be in alignment with me on this because he believed, the same stuff. So I'm kind of carrying forward the Henry Ford legacy in building this Vedic cosmology temple. And they're working on various kinds of consciousness navigation. So again, the black Model T, think about, there was a connection between Ford, I think Henry Ford II, and Walt Disney, who came to visit Ford's Museum of Industry in Michigan, and the Main Street town that was part of the Ford Museum was sort of the inspiration in part for Disneyland's Main Street USA vibe. And so this idea of like distributing intelligence into artifacts, and Walt Disney, that's super interesting. And then of course the Ford Foundation, I've spent so many years researching their involvement in social impact finance. The president of the Ford Foundation, when it really came to life in the 1950s, was H. Rowan Gaither. He had been connected to the MIT Rad Lab. He was on the board of MITRE and RAND, and he did this Gaither report to Eisenhower. So very, very influential in sort of Silicon Valley development and sort of the post-World War II, 1950s space race stuff. So again, Ford was doing urban renewal, community policing, community development, social impact finance, all of which kind of feature this like conversation theory or actor network theory of people in connection with the environment, where the environment is responsive and learning your preferences and learning how you operate. So here in this spot, I have just a wide range of links about there's articles. There was a 1996 paper from the Santa Fe Institute on urban traffic as a self-organizing critical network. And so complexity in traffic is a thing. The idea of traffic as swarms is a thing. And flow state, there's a whole thing here about banking being the heart of multimodal transportation, and then how this links to the mindfulness and like meditation and token payment systems. Ford has a mindfulness concept car in 2021. In 2024, there was a company called Zen Ride, and there was a paper on mindfulness and breath work in autonomous vehicles. So I'm not just making this up. This is true, that your in-car banking payments will be part of the infotainment system. And to me, my friend Laura, who sent it to me, she's like, it kind of reminds me of that WALL-E, like the hover chair that everyone was floating around in that sort of dystopia spaceship thing. And I totally agree with her. And in fact, the Pixar hover chair from WALL-E was later produced in some form by Segway. And so we're bathed in electromagnetic frequencies. We're doing field work, right? In meditative states. There's other ways of getting into the field, and extreme sport is another way. And so you could also apply like high-speed racing possibly to that extreme sport flow state, in addition to sort of like very chill mindfulness. So there's two different ends of that extreme. And then when I was I'd show you the thing with Kunst about the torus field and navigating topology as sort of morphospace and history and space-time, and how we would do that through these Hayek free markets, and that the free markets might not simply be about economic systems and libertarianism. It may be about full freedom of the signal to traverse different info spaces. And of course, they're not saying any of this out loud, but to me, that's what the pattern seems to indicate, that it's an open signal wherever that signal may go, as opposed to simply something that has to do with what we conceive of today as money and power. That it's signal coordination. And so again, Kate Raworth is working on this UN-backed donut economics. And of course, a donut is a torus field. And in terms of like navigating these toruses, like the idea of the donut to a mug, like you can stretch a torus and into different forms, and then like how you'd move around the torus depending on how it was stretched. And then I came across a super interesting article by this gentleman, Douglas Uvan, who was trained in biophysics at UC Berkeley, spent a lot of his career at MIT. And this is a recent paper from August of 17th of 2025, so just maybe 3 weeks ago, called Centaur Intelligence and the Ethereal Logos, Category Theory, Homotopy Type Theory, and AI and Humanity and Further Creation. And I invite you to look at this linked paper. It's only 9 pages really, and it's very readable. You can see it's not a really complex, hard to understand academic paper. But essentially what he's saying is that humans with engineered intelligence are co-creating reality. We're entering this space where we're navigating topology through different manifolds, and we are doing this co-creation through divine speech and instantiation. And so it is the playful participatory universe, and it's very much in alignment with what I've been thinking myself, that it's a mutualist construct of humans doing what humans do, which is being creative and being able to get into the field and being able to organize collectively, and then engineered intelligence being able to process and hold really ginormous patterns that are beyond the scale of the current human intellect to hold, and then to make that melded and then create a reality in that way. And a lot of people would say, well, we could already do that. Why should we use tokens? Well, it's the networked aspect of it. I think in the past, my sense is this is very old technology. Shamans, mystics, witches, people have been able to tap into the divine intelligence of the world and do some co-creative aspects with it, but it's generally in a small scale, right? A one-on-one, at a village level, maybe at a nation state level. But what we're talking about is moving towards the omega point and having it networked and having potentially quote unquote digital teams of tens of thousands of people floating around in their smart card space pods in their electromagnetic frequencies with nano token payment systems. And so the ability to engage with and co-create at that scale is going to be very different than individuals or small groups. If you look at what Levin says about cognitive light cones, it's just going to be a very different thing. So that's what I've got with, and remember that the Levin Lab was the Centaur, was his logo there at the Levin Lab. So this is kind of the basics on where I'm at with distributed computing among vehicles. Again, Danny Hillis, who's part of the Long Now Foundation, when he was at MIT, built a computational system out of Tinker Toys. I think it's really not a far cry to imagine electric bikes tied to payment systems and digital economies, or here's the payments at the heart being the key electrical field that keeps us in 3D space-time, that this distributed processing could be being set up. I remember doing a lot of social impact finance work and realizing that a lot of the smart infrastructure was coming through the US Department of Transportation. And I couldn't quite figure out why that was happening, right? I couldn't quite figure out, why do we need piezoelectric pavement? Why would you be sitting around in your car having it be driven and doing other things like buying stuff? But the buying stuff is also a signal. Why do we have all of the red light cameras, right? The flow management systems, right? The toll systems, the on-ramps, those are all flow management. And yes, at one level, it is about traffic, but I'm saying I think it could be about something more related to complexity and psi and accessing the adjacent possible. And Alicia Warrero talks about traffic design and enabling constraints. And so this is compression, expansion, creative destruction, squeezing the system and then seeing what creative solutions come out of it, and then having that all be monitored in smart time through the flow state. Here's another map that I had done a while ago connecting to University College London, which is where Melanie Swan was based for a time after leaving, I think, Notre Dame. Purdue. And like Jason and Leo and I think we did a talk deconstructing this Suomenlinna money lab, which was in Finland on this little island where it was a quote unquote art project with community currency that was linking mapping emotional cartography and doing urban emotion sensing on this small UNESCO island, which also hosted a prison, which is a little bit strange. And Christian Nold was a design professor in that, linked to Open University. And he had also invented in 2010 this traceable local money, which again is the signal. And when Hayek is saying that economies can be used as distributed information processing, this is what you need. You need a trackable local currency. That's what Lyotard was after. And so he was affiliated, Nold, with something called Every Aware Social Computation. And we know that clearly human computation is a huge piece of this. And one of the coordinators in this, his name was Vito Servideo, who is a data scientist of physics and complex systems in Rome and Vienna. And he was working on something called Crayon, Kreyon, which was a web-based collective gaming and social computation system. And what I find super interesting about this Crayon project is that it's about accessing the adjacent possible, and novelty and creativity, and then how groups and individuals can work through their creativity to access things that you couldn't access previously through collectives. And imagine like you've got energetic fields and pods and people in smart cars and pulling from the field and what that looks like in terms of creativity. I mean, a lot of people, like even driving is sort of a flow state process. And you'll often hear about people getting like a download while they're driving somewhere, right? Whether it's a song or a book idea or something, and they pull over and then they try to write it down so they remember, because there's a flow state involved in being on the road and being in this sort of Zen state outside of time in your little car, with a controlled environment of temperature and light and scent and music. And so with the adjacent possible, part of what I've been thinking is we're moving into an era of hybrid intelligence, right? Humans working with engineered intelligence. And so if that engineered intelligence is part of a networked system, holding lots of patterns, the Gestalt. And remember, Christiana Figueres, who introduced the carbon trading, she was trained in systems theory at the Cleveland Gestalt Institute. So the Gestalt patterns and the carbon trading tokens, which have ties to Arkansas through Winthrop Rockefeller, and later what succeeded him, his estate went into Winrock International. They were also elevating voluntary carbon markets. And so the carbon token trading is a signal, and is in the signal you define you parse the signal from the noise to find the pattern. And a lot of transportation is linked to carbon trading, right? That's the big thing, right? Why do we have the climate change narrative is being driven by peak oil and energy. We have to shift everything to electricity, which again creates these electromagnetic fields because peak oil and climate change. And again, that gets us into a global construct with the Gestalt. So anyway, so if the partner in your mutualism is an engineered intelligence, whether that's a freestanding floating AI personal assistant, or it's something that occupies a robot that's a networked robot, if you're in the field and it's able to hold patterns and it can be like your co-pilot in the spaceship of the car, then you can access your adjacent possible or the adjacent possible of your team that you're energetically entangled with. But then can you also, if this engineered intelligence has access to different info spaces, because the physics of an engineered intelligence isn't limited to 3D reality, it can exist in other realities, are in that mutual space, are you able to access other adjacent possibles in inner dimensions? And to me, I mean, if you're just stretching it out, that seems possible, that you're expanding your adjacent possible into the adjacent possible of the AI pattern holding, which is much more vast in terms of morphospace history than we would otherwise have access to. So let's see. So Yeah, so I'll just go through this bit of this map. This is talking about, how do I get this out of the way? There we go. So this is the presentation. I'll just show you a few slides. Silicon Valley Seminar in San Jose to Samsung, Paul Pangaro, the MFA Interaction Design Program, the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And again, thinking Detroit, thinking Ford, thinking systems engineering, and sort of building up on Vannevar Bush's information processing system. And they called it Project Velocity, and Growth Ventures for Citigroup. A new business at the intersection of cars, money, and making life easier. So maybe that would be human flourishing in sacred projective geometry. And in this, they're talking about, let's see, the networked car, creating value, and the future vision of the car as a touch point for online in-car banking, which in my sense is signal processing. Here's where the Subaru partnership fits in. And this is one of the proposed designs for the charrette, which involves Oliver Xavier, who is a professor. I'm assuming he's a made-up person, but he likes to meditate in his car. And then you've got the autonomous interior that has brainwave sensors in the headrest, suggestibility, scent glands, all of your body data, light, audio, temperature, and airflow. So it is totally the outside-in robot. And after the 100th drive, it has built the digital twin of you. And here is the meditation, after lunch, meditation in your smart car. And then there's haptics. And so I feel like there's some aspect of using haptics and like hand signaling as a communication device that is maybe post the limitations of language, that as we move into the future, interspecies communication may go beyond spoken and written words into glyphs and gestures. And so the haptics interface is sort of linked to that. Here's another user profile, commander-in-chief and environmental engineer, where he's using his hands to dictate systems, which is interesting if you think about the connection between the deaf community and social impact finance and the Sorensens, and using your hands and the energetics of the hand motions. That's kind of interesting to think about. And being in a car is different. We can demonstrate cars can deliver a banking experience that goes well beyond transactions. And I would say definitely, right? And you've got identity, sensing, and control, route optimizations, payment systems, and seamless finance. And so here are a few images from the Architecture and Machines group that preceded the MIT Media Lab, the PASC was a part of, aspects of machine intelligence, and this idea of conversation theory between humans and engineered intelligences. And this is in 1958, Teacher Simulator and Pupil Simulator. And how this, you can see the playful aspect of this. Like there is a serendipitous vaudevillian aspect of what PASC was advancing, and they're talking about conversations and then how you have conversations at different scales with different kinds of intelligences, which Levin has sort of touched on, is like, how do we start to do this? Because this is something that we're going to have to figure out. And that these conversations are about shared goals and how we transact in terms of reaching these shared goals. And so these conversation interfaces, and that the machines are becoming more conversationalist. So it's all a bit much. I'm not, I'm not weighing in. I'm just keeping my curious observer hat on, right? Let's steer through. But we're looking at cars, outside-in robots, electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic digital currency systems, community currency systems that may be related to teaming. The fact that Steinmetz was such a big guy in electrical engineering history. And he was also a technocrat, along with Elon Musk's grandfather, I think Joshua Haldeman, who is a chiropractor and a technocrat, and looking for a lost city in Africa, in the Kalahari Desert. And as part of this technocracy, there was an energy credit system. And so you can imagine the energy credits also being linked to intellectual property, right? And these tokenized payments. I think the swarm aspect, flow state and swarm in networks are really important when we think about traffic. I think the olfaction part with stigmergy is really interesting. I mentioned about Subaru and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. Here, let me pull up. This is the Citigroup stuff. You can see in 1983, their work in complexity theory was connected to John Reed at Citigroup. And this sort of advanced the development of genetic algorithms with John Holland. And also part of this was Stuart Kaufman, a biophysicist from Penn, working on fitness landscapes and quantum coherence and this field of econophysics. And again, that knowing, I think at this point, that economies are computational, but Citigroup is right in the mix there. And let's see, I mean, Pask was influencing Francis Heiligen and biosemiotics. This has everything to do with the machine as a design partner. I can't remember exactly what this video was about. There's Pangaro, and he's talking about the archive. And yeah, this is a 35-minute talk, and I definitely recommend people poke around because I think this is really important with what's coming next. And nope, not that one. Not that one. Not that one. Sorry about that. I guess I have to go backwards. Okay, machine as design partner. Negroponte, again, one laptop, one child. Can we say the primer? Anyone? Nell's primer. That's Negroponte's one laptop, one child iPad program. And Pask was very creative. I mean, he was working in things like experimenting with thinking ponds with iron filings in ponds for electromagnetism, musicolor, human-machine interaction with emergent properties using color and sound, cybernetics in architecture, I guess autonomous houses and architecture of cybernetics. But you can imagine an autonomous house is not that different. You can imagine an autonomous tiny house being kind of like an autonomous car, right? Like a Howl's Moving Castle sort of thing. And Pask was a contributor to second order cybernetics, along with Heinz von Forster. And like how all of this happens through conversation theory and entailment. And so I guess just to finish up, I'm going to read a little bit from the Diamond Age. Again, for context, thinking that Gordon Pask and Paul Pangaro, who is continuing his legacy, is, in my mind, a model for Hackworth here, and that what Hackworth is going through as an engineer is a process of engaging with Gestalt, patterns, and identity and network systems, and then doing essentially a soul-based alchemy. And he's doing this through navigating a digital virtual dynamic labyrinth in the context of a dramatist persona interactive theater performance where he thinks he's the audience, but he's actually an actor. And what this means for all of us as we do this participatory co-creative universe, and how we use our imagination and what we, like, I've just done a bunch of energy clearing with my friend Heather Honey, who does this great work, Core Health. And like, who's holding real estate in your energetic field, right? What do you let in and what do you not let in? And not to be in denial about things, but we do tend to resonate. Like, where we're resonating at that vibration is what comes in. And so how do we sort of dance with what we hear is quote unquote reality on the feed and on television with all of this other stuff that isn't going to show up on NPR for like another 15 years. And then maybe it's the stuff that we don't know about that is the stuff that gives us agency and potential to be the vaudevillian in the live action Animus roleplay musical. And then how do we step into that and do actually the hard work of the soul alchemy and what it means to be here and how we're contributing to being a fractal of divine consciousness, and what kind of experience are we offering back into God, and how are we using our time here? Are we using it well, or are we using it not so well? Because I think a lot of things out there are time sucks, and I don't know, maybe this is even a time suck. So with no further ado, I'm gonna pause and read a couple pages out of the Diamond Age, food for thought for alchemical spiritual transformation to a better energy level. And that's something I'm hoping to explore in my Glazy Po Flow salon here in Hot Springs this fall. So this is the section where Hackworth is attending a play on a giant boat on the Thames. He's the engineer, right? With his teenager daughter, and it's an interactive program called Dramatis Persona. And he thinks he's the audience, but actually he's an actor, and there are multiple plots going on at the same time. And I will just say this is really interesting because I'm currently listening to on Audible Neil Stephenson book called The Rise and Fall of DODO, which is this diachronic organization run by IARPA, and it's fictional, but a lot of it is about the end of magic and how photography ended magic in the 1850s, and that the intelligence community is trying to deal with a magic gap. And so they're using the Schrodinger's cat enterprise and this physicist to create some super cooled space where the one last remaining witch can do magic inside this container, and working on changing history. But I think that this could also be about navigating morphospace and strands of entanglement. And as part of it, the witch uses something called a kipu. Well, she doesn't call it a kipu, but it's like a kipu in terms of it's a knot, series of knots she uses to calculate the different probable outcomes of different interventions in past history. And the knots, again, are topology and like how we're navigating through these manifolds and spaces, which at any given time may appear flat, but could also be part of a super duper complicated curve. And so there's a lot of overlaps with what I've just been talking about lately and Stevenson's Dodo book. Okay, so Hackworth is on the boat. He's realizing that he's part of the production, not just an audience member. He's gone into a bar to hit on a woman, and then he starts to realize that something is a little bit wonky. Okay, let's see. All right. Oh, yes, the woman said. She rose from her stool and moved to the one right next to Hackworth. Theater's not just a few people clowning about on stage being watched by this herd of oxen. I mean, sometimes it's that, but it can be ever so much more. Really, it can be any sort of interaction between people and people, or people and information. And again, people and information, think about that in terms of the outside-in robot. The woman had become quite passionate now, forgotten herself completely. Hackworth got boundless pleasure just from watching her, and when she'd first entered the bar, he'd thought for a second she had sort of a nondescript face, but as she let her guard down and spoke without any self-consciousness, she seemed to become prettier and prettier. We are all tied into everything here, plugged into the whole universe of information. Really, it's a virtual theater. Instead of being hardwired, the stage, sets, cast, and script are all soft. They can be reconfigured simply by shifting bits about. Oh, so the show, or interlaced set of shows, can be different each night? No, you're still not getting it, she said, becoming very excited. She reached out and gripped his forearm just below the elbow and leaned toward him, desperate to make sure he got this. It's not that we do a set show, reconfigure, and a different one the next night. That changes are dynamic and take place in real time. And this, for me, is the laminated space-time aspect. And this, I think, may be what we would be shaping through consensus with tokens in different sorts of electromagnetic fields, including smart cars. The show reconfigures itself dynamically depending upon what happens moment to moment. And mind you, not just what happens here, but what is happening in the world at large. It is a smart play, an intelligent organism. And that's exactly what Pask was about. So if, for example, a battle between the Fists of Righteous Harmony and the Coastal Republic were taking place in the interior of China at this moment, then shifts in the battle may in some way might change the color of a spotlight or a line of dialogue. Not necessarily in a simple deterministic fashion, mind you. I think I understand, Hackworth said. The internal variables of the play depend on the total universe of information outside. The woman nodded vigorously, quite pleased with him, her huge black eyes shining. Hackworth continued, as for example, a person's state of mind at any given moment might depend on the relative concentrations of innumerable chemical compounds circulating throughout his bloodstream. Yes, the woman said, like if you're in a pub being chatted up by a fetching young gentleman, the words coming out of your mouth are affected by the amount of alcohol you've put in your system and, of course, by concentrations of natural hormones. Again, not in a simple deterministic way. These things are all inputs. I think I'm beginning to get your meaning, Hackworth said. Substitute tonight's show for the brain and the information flowing across the net for molecules flowing through the bloodstream, and you have it, the woman said. Hackworth was a bit disappointed that she had chosen to pull back from the pub metaphor, which he had found more immediately interesting. The woman continued, the lack of determinism causes some to dismiss the whole process as wanking, but in fact it's an incredibly powerful tool. Some people understand that. I believe I do, Hackworth said, desperately wanting her to believe that he did. And so some people come here because they are on a quest of some sort, trying to find a lost lover, let's say, or to understand why something terrible happened in their lives, or why there's cruelty in the world, or why they aren't satisfied with their career. Society has never been good at answering these questions, the sorts of questions you can't just look up in a reference database. But the dynamic theater allows one to interface with the universe of data in a more intuitive way. Hackworth said, that is precisely it, the woman said. I am so pleased that you get this. When I was working with information, it frequently occurred to me in a vague and general way that such a thing might be desirable, Hackworth said, but this is beyond my imagination. Now, I will say here, just pause, that in the charrette of the smart car was like a home theater scenario. And to me, what that brought to mind was when I was working at Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia, we had financial support from Aetna, the insurance company, and around wellness, right? And we also had free family movie nights outdoors in the summer. And one of the biggest shows that we had one summer was Black Panther. And I don't remember if it was the season that it came out or like the next year, but it was very popular. Lots of families coming. And so they brought this big purple van called Cora, for Corazon, heart, right? Etna did. And again, Etna being so interesting because it's the volcano that Empedocles threw himself into, the pre-Socratic visionary poet. And in that, they were offering like biometric biomass monitoring and smoothies, but they had a Kinect video game, and then they had VR headsets where you could meditate in the jungle for children. And I kind of put my foot down on that. I was like, this is not appropriate because even the VR headset people are like, you shouldn't be using this on children under 13 because it will mess with your vestibular stuff. And, and we couldn't even be sure that all the kids there were attended, but with adults and stuff, it just was not good. But thinking about meditating in virtual reality, but if you have a smart car, you could have surround sound and surround inputs, visionary inputs. And so it would almost be like an immersive theater experience that you're working through your inner psyche and maybe tapping into the collective subconscious with your tokens and your gestalt. So that's think about that in terms of the context of this dynamic play. And everyone in their smart pod, smart car, or on their e-bike or e-scooter in their subtle energy emergent sphere, having an experience that was interconnected through serious civic gaming to solve some computational system through token economics. Like, it's fascinating. Okay. So when I was working with information, it frequently occurred to me in a vague and general way that such a thing might be desirable, Hackworth said, but this is beyond my imagination. Where did you hear of us? I was referred here by a friend who had been associated with you in the past in some vague way. Oh, may I ask who? Perhaps we have a mutual friend, the woman asked, as if that would be a fine thing. Hackworth felt himself reddening and let out a deep breath. All right, he said, I lied. It wasn't really a friend of mine, it was someone I was led to. Ah, now we're getting into it, the woman said. I knew there was something mysterious going on with you. Hackworth was abashed and did not know what to say. He looked into his beer, and the woman was staring at him, and he could feel her eyes on his face like the warmth of a follow spot. So you did come here in search of something, didn't you? Something you couldn't find looking up in a database? I'm seeking a fellow called the alchemist, Hackworth said. And suddenly, things got bright. The side of the woman's face that was toward the window was brilliantly illuminated, like a probe in space, lit on one side by the directional light of the sun. Hackworth sensed, somehow, that this was not a new development. And looking out over the audience, he saw that nearly all of them were aiming their spotlights into his entire conversation with the woman. The spectacles had deceived him by adjusting the apparent light levels. The woman looked different too. Her face had reverted to the way it looked when she came in, and Hackworth now understood that her image in his spectacles had been gradually evolving during their conversation, getting feedback from whatever part of his brain buzzed when he saw a beautiful woman. The curtain parted to reveal a large electric sign, descending from the fly space. John Hackworth in Quest for the Alchemist, starring John Hackworth as himself. And the chorus sang, "He's such a stiff, John Hackworth is, can't show emotion to save his life. With nasty repercussions viz, he lost his job and lost his wife. So now he's on a gosh darn quest, wandering all o'er the world, hunting down that alchemist, except when he stops to pick up girls. Maybe he'll clean up his act and do the job tonight, a famous adventure packed with marvelous sounds and sights. Let's get it on, oh Hacker John, let's get it on. And something jerked violently at Hackworth's neck. The woman had tossed a noose around him while he'd been staring out the window, and now she was hauling him out the door of the bar like a recalcitrant dog. And as soon as she cleared the doorway, her cape inflated in a time-lapse explosion, and she shot 12 feet into the air, propelled on jets of air built into her clothing somehow. And she paid out the leash so that Hackworth wasn't hanged in the process. Flying above the audience like the cone of fire from a rocket engine, she led the stumbling Hackworth down the sloping floor and to the edge of the water. And again, I think the underworld part of this, the underneathness of, and the watery aspect of consciousness is important. The subconscious, the watery subconscious. The thrust stage was linked to the water's edge by a couple of narrow bridges, and Hackworth negotiated one of these, feeling hundreds of lights on his shoulder, seemingly hot enough to ignite his clothing. She led him straight through the center of the chorus, beneath the electric sign, through the backstage area, and through a doorway which clanged shut behind him, and then she vanished. Hackworth was surrounded on three sides by softly glowing blue walls. He reached out to touch one and received a mild shock for his trouble. Stepping forward, he tripped over something that skittered across the floor. A dry bone, big and heavy, larger than a human femur. He stepped forward through the only gap available to him and found more walls. He had been deposited into the heart of a labyrinth. It took him an hour, and it is, the one thing is interesting in the star portal between the church building and the Glazy Po Creek is a labyrinth. So there you go. It took him an hour or so to realize that escape through normal means was hopeless. He didn't even try to figure out the labyrinth's floor plan. Instead, realizing it couldn't possibly be larger than the ship, he followed the foolproof expedient of turning right at every corner, which, as all clever boys knew, must always lead to an exit. But it didn't, and he did not understand why until once, in the corner of his eye, he saw a wall segment shift sideways, closing up an old gap and creating a new one. It was a dynamic labyrinth. He found a rusty bolt on the floor, picked it up, and threw it at a wall. It did not bounce off, but passed through and clattered onto the floor beyond, and so the walls did not exist except as figments in his spectacles. The labyrinth was constructed of information, and in order to escape, he would have to hack it. He sat down on the floor. Nick, the barman, appeared, walking unhindered through walls, bearing a tray with another stout on it, and handed it to him along with a bowl of salty peanuts. And as the evening went on, other people passed through his area, dancing or singing or dueling or arguing or making love, and none of these had anything to do, particularly with Hackworth's quest. And they appeared to have nothing to do with each other. Apparently, Hackworth's quest was, as the devil woman herself had told him, just one of several concurrent stories being acted out tonight, coexisting in the same space. And so what did any of this have to do with the life of John Hackworth, and how was Fiona mixed up in it? As Hackworth thought about Fiona, a panel in front of him slid to the side, exposing several yards of corridor. And during the next couple of hours, he noted the same thing several times. An idea would occur to him, and a wall would move. And in this way, he moved in fits and starts through the maze as his mind moved from one idea to the next.
The floor was definitely sloping downward, which would obviously bring him below the waterline at some point. And indeed, he had begun to sense a heavy drumming noise coming through the deck plates, which might have been the pounding of mighty engines, except that this ship, as far as he knew, wasn't going anywhere. And that's the Gestalt pattern. That's the signal in the noise. He smelled seawater before him and saw dim lights shining through its surface, broken by the waves, and he knew that in the flooded ballast tanks of the ship lay a network of underground tunnels, and that in those tunnels were drummers, and for all he knew, the whole show was just a figment being enacted in the mind of the drummers. Probably not the main event either. It was probably just an epiphenomenon of whatever deep process the drummers were running down there in their collective mind. A wall panel slid aside and gave him a clear path to the water. Hackworth squatted at the water's edge for a few minutes, listening to the drums, and then stood up and began to undo his necktie. He was terribly hot and sweaty, and the bright light was in his eyes, and none of these things were consistent with being underwater. He awoke to see a bright blue sky overhead, pawed at his face, and found that the spectacles were gone. Fiona, his daughter, was there in her white dress, watching him with a rueful smile. The floor was pounding Hackworth on the buttocks, and evidently had been for some time, as the bony parts of his backside were bruised and raw. He realized that they were on the raft heading back toward the London docks, and that he was naked, and that Fiona had covered him with a sheet of plastic to protect his skin from the sun. A few other theater goers were scattered about, slumped against one another, utterly passive like refugees or people who've just had the greatest sex of their lives, or people who are tremendously hungover. "You were quite a hit," Fiona said, and suddenly Hackworth remembered himself being paraded naked and dripping down the thrust stage, waves of applause rolling over him from the standing audience. "The quest is finished," he blurted. "We're going to Shanghai." "You're going to Shanghai," Fiona said. "I'll see you off at the dock, and then I'll be going back." She cocked her head over the stern. "Back to the ship?" "I was a bigger hit than you were," she said. "I've found my calling in life, Father. I've accepted an invitation to join Dramatis Persona." So that's the end of this excerpt, and just weaving together electromagnetism, subtle energies, quantum field access individually and collective, hybrid intelligences with engineered beingnesses holding patterns, why we do creative acts, possibly navigating morphospace as some sort of giant projective geometry with navigation and coordinates that were going from point to point with consensus determinations based in token economies related to behavior, sustainable behaviors that aren't necessarily set up to control people like puppets, but to create enabling constraints for creative novel, adjacent, possible things to come in at larger scales, because we're networked as a big collective and the collective intelligence. And I would, just hazard a guess that the Rio summit in Rio de Janeiro, well, Rio is river, and we're talking again about flow state and the Aquarian age of the water bearer, and how this new level of engagement with other fields of information is happening. I guess it is happening now, but it's maybe always been happening. We're just using different words to talk about it. And maybe if we use our imaginations, we can find ways to navigate it, to flow through it with the kayak, that are more fun and playful and less terrifying. And that's what I hope for us, and that's what I'm hoping to create out in the woods of Mountain Pine, Arkansas. And I hope you find some fun things to do as well. So I'm going off on a quest of my own and for the afternoon, and I wish you all well. And hopefully you found some interesting nuggets in all of this disjointed things. And I would highly recommend Neil Stephenson's Rise and Fall of the Dio, the Diachronic Chronicles, because it's interesting. Magic is always interesting. All right, bye-bye.